where we seek to engage, the procurement fraternity at large and on topics of interest, and we think this is a prime topic for today. Let me tell you a little bit more about Zycus, though. Zycus is an end-to-end integrated software suite provider that covers source-to-pay processes, so everything from spend analytics to e-sourcing, contract and supplier management, procure-to-pay, and financial savings management in terms of a process flow. And then if you look at in the center of this kind of dartboard diagram here, the bullseye highlights areas where the software platform brings together the entire source-to-pay process. One view, which is a dashboard that provides visibility across the different functional modules. iManage, which is a way to implement a project management discipline around category sourcing projects. And iRequest, one area we'll feature today, is a relatively newer application space, a way for procurement teams to more effectively and efficiently engage end-user stakeholders. So really creating this focus on the customer experience that we're going to be delving into today. A little bit more about Zycus. First of all, we're recognized as a leader in this space by Gartner's Magic Quadrant. The past 3 reports, for example, of their strategic sourcing suite, Magic Quadrant, have shown Zycus as a leader. Specifically, they cited Zycus's high level of customer satisfaction, consistent quality across the suite, which in the case of the strategic sourcing suite consists of spend analytics, e-sourcing, contract lifecycle management, and supply-based management. And Gartner is, of course, not the only key and influential research and analyst firm in the space. Forrester as well has also cited Zycus as a leader in their Forrester Wave report for both e-procurement and contract lifecycle management. So lots of bona fides in the case of Zycus that we can point to. And now let's get into the content, the agenda that I intend to cover today. First of all, we're going to introduce this idea of customer centricity. And there's a lot of different terminology that you can use. Customer intimacy is another term that's often used. KYC, know your customer, has come into favor. And of course, many of these concepts would have originated more on the sell side with that customer orientation. But what we're seeing much more frequently here of late is procurement adopting this mindset, recognizing that procurement, in fact, serves a number of customers as well, a variety of internal stakeholders across the business, as well as external stakeholders, which would be the supply base. So it's a relatively newer phenomenon that we're going to talk about today. And we're also going to make the case that having this customer-centric orientation translates to superior or world-class performance for those procurement departments that are taking these steps. And we'll start with digitization, because automating core sourcing and procurement processes would really be a prerequisite to attaining this level of customer centricity, because after all, if you're engaging your internal stakeholders in sort of manual or offline and inefficient kind of processes, it's very difficult to develop that level of intimacy with those customers. So we'll talk about why digitization is so important. And the focus here is on establishing what we'll call an omni-channel access and personalized user experience. So lots of big words there. I'll define what we mean by those as we get into the content here today. And we'll talk about how a focus on customer experience is really enabled by this new class of applications called request management. And I'll share with you a couple of case studies in this area, including a customer case study, Porsche, what the iconic, performance sports car maker headquartered in Germany. We'll talk about what they've been doing in North America to really build a world-class kind of customer-centric procurement function. And we'll talk, too, about how critical P2P is in establishing this type of relationship with end users. Because after all, procure-to-pay is probably the area where your stakeholders would engage most frequently with procurement when they need a product or service, create a requisition, are looking to receive the items that they need to complete their tasks and their day-to-day jobs. And we'll talk about what matters to both internal customers as regards procure-to-pay and also suppliers, that they're customers too and critical collaborators in this whole process. Now, when we talk about customers, the final concept we'll establish here is that it's important to prioritize and segment that customer base from a procurement standpoint, just in order to make sure that you're allocating your resources to the highest priority opportunities. So not all customers, in fact, are created equally. Some may be more worthy of more attention and devotion from your side, and others may be better to enable them through more of a self-service approach. So as we go throughout today, please feel free to use the Q&A dialog box in the WebEx platform to ask any questions. I'll do my best to answer as many of those as I can as we go through today. So let's talk about digitization first, and the fact that breakthrough efficiency gains are really being realized and made possible through a fully digital procurement process. And this benchmark data here from the Hackett Group illustrates the fact that, there's always been this disparity between world-class performers and the average overall, the peer group. But I think what's so interesting here is that whereas the world-class performers that have already automated, in many cases, their core sourcing and procurement processes and had seen in recent years a plateauing effect where there's their efficiency gains in terms of their productivity as measured as a percentage of the spend that the procurement function cost represents, that had leveled off and had reached the point of diminishing returns. But what's being highlighted here is that even those top performers, the world-class organizations, taking this next step in digitization to establish this kind of a linkage with their customer base can enable really a breakthrough level of the next wave of performance improvement on the order of 35% gains in terms of cost productivity in the procurement function. So that's really good news even for those world-class organizations that maybe thought they'd done all they could. Now, even for the peer group overall, this digitization opportunity really represents for them the potential to close the gap on those world-class performers. So efficiency gains incrementally on the order of about a quarter at 24%, still substantial even for the sort of the run-of-the-mill or the average procurement team out there. So really compelling opportunity in those respects. So let's take a look at what some of these companies, especially the world-class performers, have done to establish a customer-centric type of a culture. And of course, it's not just about technology, it's also about organization and about process. And from an organization standpoint, one of the things that the world class has done to a much greater extent than the peer group overall is they focused on establishing formal service level agreements with their internal customers. So they're about 2/3 more likely, 65% more in the world class, to have taken that critical step. And likewise, when you look at the type of programs they've implemented to elicit the voice of the customer from their internal stakeholders, it's really those world-class organizations, which are typically the top 20% or so, that have taken the most significant strides in this area. So for example, about 20% have some type of a formal customer management process, if not an explicit customer management organization devoted to engaging the stakeholder base. Now, it's much more common, especially in the sort of the average or the peer group overall, to focus on stakeholder engagement in the course of a strategic sourcing project, but not as a formal organizational role or department. They do it on a case-by-case or project-by-project basis. Now, almost one quarter really say we don't do it at all. So they're really behind the curve and really missing out on opportunities, because after all, engaging stakeholders more efficiently, more frequently means procurement getting involved earlier in the process, being able to influence a greater percentage of the spend, and therefore being able to drive much greater contributions to the overall value to the organization. So let's talk about some other best practices in this area. This data, again, from the Hackett Group, where they're talking about creating an omni-channel and personalized stakeholder experience. So what does omni-channel really mean? It really means making the procurement function available and accessible through all manner of means, whatever is most convenient for that stakeholder. So whether that's a traditional web application through a laptop or desktop computer, or through a mobile device, or through voice access or social media, it means being available to those stakeholders 24/7 in whatever means is most efficient for them to engage and communicate with the procurement function. And setting up this kind of ubiquitous access through an omni-channel type of environment also means that by giving everyone access, it doesn't mean you're giving everyone equal access. So personalizing that stakeholder experience is just as critical as being easily accessible, in that different stakeholders should have access to different applications or different content just because of privacy concerns or based on their role in the organization. So very critical that the procurement tools, the technology that gets deployed, has the sophistication from a user management standpoint to be permission-based. So really make sure that your users get all the information that they need, but just what they need. So if you have sensitive contracts, for example, certain key stakeholders should have access to those, whereas others shouldn't. So it's really a critical component there as well. So let's look then at what are some of the top initiatives that are being undertaken today by organizations across industries to enhance customer centricity with both internal and external stakeholders. So this is a survey that Hackett Group did, and a number of responses included here. And of course, number one on the list is better reporting, providing a feedback channel to the stakeholders, simplifying processes, and P2P automation as that core process coming in at number three. Making sure to focus both on the internal as well as the external customers. So the number four is a supplier portal to be able to more efficiently onboard and enable suppliers. And I won't go through all of the responses here, and some of them start to repeat as you go through. But down the list here at number 9, with 32% reporting establishing internal self-service status checking. So this really points towards this emerging space that I mentioned around request management. So not every request is a requisition. End user stakeholders may have any number of reasons to contact the procurement function, and a group of early adopters, 32% in this case, say they're deploying tools, an accessible type of a technology platform to engage those stakeholders around all manner of requests that they may have. So let's talk about what it takes to establish a request management capability. And what I wanted to do is start with a case study from, in fact, the world's largest software company, Microsoft. This was a case study that they presented earlier this year at Hackett's Best Practices Conference, and I would say that it's an extremely compelling case study and certainly helpful to gauge what's being done, in this case, by the world's largest software company, which may be in a slightly unique position in that being the world's largest software company, they have access to development resources to build their own application in this space, which most companies may not have access to. But let's take a look first at what Microsoft has done, and certainly looking at the demographics, very significant in terms of the size and scope of the procurement operation for Microsoft. So 250 FTEs within the procurement function, 30 at a corporate sourcing type of a role. Significant spend, obviously $21 billion in indirect spend in this case. Very large supply base, over 30,000, although Microsoft, as one of the leaders in the space, had, even with such a large supply base, had significantly pursued a supplier rational or spend consolidation strategy, really, to the point that 90% of that spend, the $21 billion, was concentrated within the top 400 suppliers. So by any measure, including the savings, which is a very healthy and robust 14%, a highly successful, high-performing procurement team, which nevertheless found that when it came to engaging their stakeholders, when it came to this idea of customer centricity, the situation that they had on hand was really that they were creating a complex environment that was confusing for their end users. So looking at the before picture, if you will, here, there were over 12 different ways to buy a product or service, and a myriad of different tools and applications to use. So I guess a blessing and a curse for a software company, they have lots of developers, and the rule is that developers will develop. So they actually found a proliferation of lots of different overlapping tools. So users were bombarded with multiple different ways to buy things and multiple different tools to use, so very confusing in that regard. Plus, they also had overlapping and contradicting policies, so 73 different policies just at the corporate level, and at a local country level, a proliferation of hundreds of different policies that, again, could be contradictory or overlapping, and certainly not easily accessible or easy to find. One of the things that Microsoft did, too, that was interesting is really tried to quantify what is the cost, the cost of quality in terms of, this inefficiency and complexity. What is it costing the business? And they actually calculated 24 million hours per year being tied up, a productivity drain based on the wait time, which really wasn't too extensive, 3 days on average to get a PO process, but with the volume of purchase orders that they had and the number of stakeholders, not just the requester, but the approvers and other people involved in the PO process, they calculated 24 million hours a year lost in productive labor. So clearly, the picture that emerged to Microsoft was that there's a problem here, we have to do something about it, and started with this customer focus. And sort of the guiding principles that they put in place was, starting with content. Content is king. So let's make sure that when users engage procurement, access our portal or our procurement platform, that they can find relevant, current, and accurate content, not 73 different policies, but the one policy that pertains to what we're trying to accomplish. So those policies themselves had to be simple, easy to understand, clear. The user experience certainly ought to be much more intuitive and engaging. And, they focus, too, on communication, so telling the right story, so the messaging from procurement out to the business stakeholders was really a focus for them as well, to make sure that they're getting the message out about all the things procurement can deliver, the value contribution, and why they should engage procurement in the first place. And they really focused on data too. So having the analytics and the reporting available meant that those engagements with their stakeholders become fact-based, where they can show the aggregate spend for that category, potential savings, those kinds of things. It really makes a difference in convincing those stakeholders that engaging the procurement team is not just something that's mandated, but it's actually beneficial to them, that it will be more efficient for them, it will help them to meet their budget targets, all those kinds of messages, and using data to tell that story. So give you a glimpse of what Microsoft put in place. Again, being in kind of a unique position as the world's largest software company, they were able to develop their own tool called ProcureWeb, and give that user sort of a consumer-like experience where they reach this procurement portal and they have a drop-down and they can initiate a request based on a variety of things, whether they need to find out more about how to put in place a contract, buy some software, learn about the buying process in general, or just find who the right contact is within the procurement function to help them with their request. A variety of means to simply and easily engage the procurement function. And certainly they simplified the user experience as a process. So standardizing, starting with one view of what a purchase order looks like, a single standard format, being accessible and available, so 24/7 kind of chat support and visibility tracking throughout, and actively seeking feedback from the stakeholders. And something as simple as, when you complete your experience, your request of procurement, send us a smile, send us a frown, tell us what your experience was like, so that we can really continuously improve. The other anecdote that they shared in telling this case study, the Microsoft folks, is that when they first were doing the prototyping and testing of the ProcureWeb application, their focus group, if you will, was of course at Microsoft a bunch of developers. So very tech savvy, obviously, skewing more towards the millennial crowd, not easily impressed, of course, by any new application or so on. And the feedback that they got from that group, that focus group, if you will, was basically it didn't suck. So it was not too annoying, which counted as a win, certainly amongst that type of stakeholder, that to be at least kind of neutral in that case really represented success. So as I said, this is really helpful to kind of identify what one of the pioneers has done, Microsoft, but not necessarily available for most organizations. Wouldn't have that type of IT resource readily available, that development talent, or really core competence in building, enterprise class type of user software. So most organizations that want to go down this path are looking towards a commercial off-the-shelf software capability, and this is an area where Zycus has developed a request management tool. It's called iRequest. And I'll just share with you a little bit about how this new class of application is really creating that bridge between procurement and the customer base, those internal stakeholders in particular, to more efficiently engage the procurement team on the right projects. So from a process standpoint, it really starts with a user creating a request and being able to track that through the process. So think of tools that have been established, for customer support or help desk teams with trouble tickets and those kinds of things being a precursor to this. But it starts with someone saying, I need something, and being able to track the status of that through the process. And that typically includes some type of an approval. So an approval workflow that says the end user's request is in fact appropriate for procurement to work on based on the approval levels that are established. And I think that's really important, because otherwise procurement could just be bombarded with all manner of requests, and without that triaging or prioritization of those requests could end up working on the wrong thing. So big part of the value is that any request is properly approved and flows into the procurement department and routed to the queue of the appropriate person to adjudicate then that request. And we've got significant number of different procurement-related use cases. So an end user could engage procurement with a request to onboard a new supplier, or a need to create a sourcing event, put a contract in place, a request to create a scorecard to measure supplier performance, or a development plan for a supplier, corrective action plan, to initiate a project. Any variety of requests, all of which could flow through this request management front end or portal, if you will, and importantly then feed the downstream functional processes to then properly administer or adjudicate that request. So feeding the contract management tool with the contract request, or the e-sourcing tool, and carrying over the information that the requester was able to provide about exactly what their requirement is, the specifications, their timing, a variety of other information, capturing all that such that it's a seamless process flow. Now, to be very effective from a feature standpoint, since this is at its core a forms-based model and application, it has to be a very configurable and flexible form, because after all, the variety of different requests mean they're inherently different. So different attributes, different requirements, therefore different fields on the form that initiates the request. And likewise, those requests span different categories, different expenditure levels, which means that the approvals have to also be very configurable to route them to the appropriate levels of approvers based on the request type, and then having conditional logic and rules as well. So if I have a request to source a particular type of a technology category, maybe cloud-based software, for example, that ought to then kick off an IT security review process. So having that type of sophistication built into the process. And of course, we're talking about ultimately identifying different budget impacts for these various requests. So being able to calculate the fields and be able to identify what the commitment levels are. Since a variety of approvers might be involved, being able to delegate approvals as needed to make sure that the process continues to flow, even if someone happens to be out of the office or unavailable, and of course, reporting across the board. So lots of capabilities built into this type of request management solution, and wanted to then share really another example, which is a way in which this tool can be used in a more generic fashion. So what we've seen is customers using the request management tool not just for traditional procurement-specific requests, but across different functions. So this tool could be used for IT to request and get approval on software installation or help desk support. In the facilities area, you know, to book a facility, a hotel, to set up you know, an office location, those kinds of things, and you can see a number of different functional applications from marketing, sales to HR, finance, travel and expense. So it's one of the ways in which procurement can not only be on the leading edge of, attaining world-class performance within the procurement function, but can also be a bellwether to other areas of the organization, that establishing this type of capability could be transferable to other functional groups. So I wanted to take you through a customer case study now. I mentioned Porsche, the iconic automaker, these high-performance cars, a German-based manufacturer, and specifically what we've done working with Porsche Cars North America. And their mandate spans 11 different North American affiliates, including Porsche Canada, Porsche Latin America, and Porsche Financial Services, in addition to the Porsche Cars North America. So let's take a look here at some of the existing challenges that they faced that led them towards this kind of digitization in the procurement function to really establish a more customer-friendly or customer-centric approach. So they weren't completely devoid of tools. What they had, in fact, were some point solutions for different components within the source-to-pay process. So a point solution for contracts, which was a repository only. They didn't have the automation of the authoring process in place. A point solution just for ERFX or e-sourcing as well. No real tools in place other than email or phone to handle the request management and request tracking. Pretty standard Microsoft project for project tracking and reporting, and of course the core means of onboarding and maintaining supplier information was the ERP supplier master. So with this came a lot of challenges, certainly with various point solutions and different levels of automation. None of these applications were talking to each other, so lots of inefficiencies built into the process, leading to low user adoption and really no means of creating enterprise-wide end-to-end visibility to what's going on with a request or with a project. Really critical for the business leadership to have that kind of visibility, and certainly was a key driver towards taking a more comprehensive approach to how to digitize the procurement process at Porsche. So some of the goals, therefore, given those challenges, clearly the goal was to create a seamless flow of information by deploying an integrated suite of solutions that would be easy to use, driving high levels of user adoption across both the procurement department user as well as the business user. So it was, how do we create this kind of collaboration? And at the end of the day, we want to make sure we have one version of the truth by consolidating all the procurement data. And from a management standpoint, the top leadership of the business wanted visibility into those projects, and a significant volume of projects and spend. You can see over 1,200 contracts. In the initial phase, they did more than 80 sourcing events, onboarded over 1,700 suppliers, and tracked over 45 discrete category-level projects in the project management tool iManage, with a significant savings contribution from those projects of 15 million plus. So how did they do it? What did they seek to accomplish? Of course, the paraphrase, the Porsche principle, is really about translating performance into speed and success. So in their case, in digitizing the procurement function, they went from 0 to 60 really fast, just the way that Porsche cars do as well, and realized some very significant benefits. Really having transparency and visibility to all the projects across the organization. And so they deployed an integrated suite of tools consisting of the sourcing, the project management, the supplier information management tool, the contract management, and then the front end to this whole thing was the request management tool called iRequest. So establishing a process and really a discipline that says everything starts with self-service end user access. So the first principle in the Porsche principle for automation here was wherever possible, let's make it easy for users to find what they need on their own so that they don't necessarily have to engage procurement at all. So, you know, requests that they can do on their own really free up more time for the procurement team to focus their attention on the highest value activities and tasks. So that was the first guiding principle. Let's give access, again, on a permission and role-based basis to let users find what they need on their own as appropriate. They need to find a report or find a contract, whatever it happens to be. But for all those others where they need assistance, have those end users always enter through this portal and initiate a request through the request management or iRequest process. And you know, in those cases, it's really about creating the visibility and the accountability and authority for those requests. So they have over 190 approvers involved in this process, and not just procurement, but engineering and the IT security reviews, the controllers in finance, a variety of cross-functional stakeholders, and for many of these, 4 to 5 levels of approval. So by the time a request goes through the automated approval routing and lands on procurement's desk, they know that it's a fully sanctioned and prioritized project. So really driving that level of accountability, both within the procurement function, but also for end users to be able to track their status and disposition of that request at each step of the process. And along the way, creating the kind of process integration that really drives much greater efficiencies. So, you know, in the case of the request for supplier onboarding, actually including that conditional logic that says based on the type of supplier being added to the master file, this type of supplier requires an IT security review process. So automatically launching that process based on the type of request and the workflow really drove great levels of efficiency gain and much greater collaboration between the procurement shared services function and the end user stakeholders across their business. So one of the earlier adopters of this new class of application, seeing great benefits by digitizing not only the core functional processes within sourcing and procurement, you know, sourcing, contract management, supplier management, but also adding this portal on the front end to adjudicate and manage end user requests as efficiently as possible. So the other area that I mentioned that's really key to establishing customer centricity is a focus on procure to pay, because this may be the one functional area that end users interact with procurement most frequently on, you know, as they have a need to request a product or service in their day-to-day process. Now, the bad news, if you will, looking at this Hackett poll of end users as regards to their current P2P is that satisfaction levels are, you know, relatively low. So, you know, if we look at this, only 4% would say they're fully satisfied. So 25% in total that would say they're at least somewhat satisfied, but most are either sort of neutral or skewing towards the somewhat dissatisfied or not satisfied at all. So not that surprising, since you know, many organizations are still using sort of their first generation procure-to-pay tools that may be part of the incumbent ERP process or ERP platform, but not providing the kind of end user engagement that would really drive much higher levels of user satisfaction. But certainly this market is growing rapidly as many organizations are looking to replace those first generation procure-to-pay platforms with the next generation procure-to-pay that has that more consumer-like, if you will, the Amazon-like or type of experience, to the point that the market for procure-to-pay tools is growing 13%, according to the Forrester Wave projection. So there's a significant renaissance, if you will, a renewal of interest in P2P, specifically to address these kinds of user satisfaction reports that indicate users on average are less than satisfied with their experience when they engage with a procure-to-pay tool. So if we want to create higher levels of user satisfaction, higher levels of adoption, what does it mean to have a customer-focused P2P type of a platform? And here Hackett's identified some key characteristics, you know, that you're streamlining the user experience, that you enable independence. You know, users more and more want to be able to do as much self-service as possible, and that's not just, you know, doing the point and click, fill the shopping cart and check out, but once I check out, I want to have complete visibility to what's the status of my request, where is it in the approval cycle, and since I may be the key interface to the vendor all the way through to the payment process, tries to reach me and find out, did you get my invoice, is it going to be paid, you've got that information at your fingertips. So the other things then that really come into play here are procurement with regards to their P2P processes, establishing those service level agreements and scorecards to get the feedback from the stakeholders to really continuously improve this process. So what's top on the list of P2P customer when you look at establishing customer centricity? It starts with well-defined processes, process automation, full user support, help desk support, that self-service capability to check status on any of their requests, and getting the feedback on a frequent basis. Now, Hackett's also identified there are 3 characteristics of top P2P performers, and it starts with this focus on internal stakeholders that we're paying so much attention to today. And, you know, by focusing on internal stakeholders, procurement realizes the benefits of compliance as well. So having a more engaging, more intuitive process actually drives greater adoption and compliance, to the point that top performers can point to 85% of their spending that goes through the preferred approved channels, so compliant spend as opposed to, you know, maverick purchases. And one way that, you know, Zycus is focused to accomplish that is by introducing this notion of guided buying using artificial intelligence. So make it easier for users to do the right thing by guiding them to the relevant category and preferred suppliers, making the process of the search easy for them, but also completing the transaction equally easy. So by using an artificial intelligence, you can automatically complete for the end user all the information at checkout. So being able to assign the category and GL code on behalf of the user, so that they don't have to think about any of that information, or automatically initiating the approval workflow process and defaulting things like ship to and bill to addresses. So all of those things could be nuisances for end users that a tool like an artificial intelligence for guided buying can enable and make much more efficient. Next comes into information digitization. So clearly the top performing organizations are much more likely to have accurate data. So really twice the amount of visibility at a granular level of spending. So at the not only the supplier level, but down to the category and line item level details of spending. And they're much more likely, therefore, to be able to drive spend compliant to contract. So better than 2/3 of spending compliant to contract for top performers versus less than 50% for the average peer group. And here the innovation from a Zycus standpoint has been to really create this linkage between P2P and contract management called contract lock. So after all, even for the top performing P2P organizations, only 25% of their spending is on a catalog and about 40% of the transaction volume. So that means 75% or more of spending that goes through a P2P process is not through a catalog for something like office supplies or some of the IT type products. And there that means that much of the spending is for services or non-standard, non-catalogable products. So creating that integration point between P2P and contracts is really critical to driving compliant behavior and ease of use for end users as well. So being able to, for instance, flip a contract directly into a catalog or to create a requisition for non-catalog items from a pre-configured category-specific form that then references at the PO generation level the contract information so that doesn't have to be repeated, doesn't end up with a mismatch on the back end when you go to approve the invoice and do a three-way match and really complete that full cycle. So the last step or last characteristic that identifies top P2P performers, the process automation extends all the way to the supply base. So after all, in P2P, you're delivering purchase orders, hopefully electronically to the suppliers. They're doing a PO acknowledgement, may even be sending back an advance ship notice, certainly sending an invoice, again, hopefully electronically. But this is an area where the top performers have, again, distanced themselves from the industry overall. So they're almost twice as likely to have a no-touch, fully electronic PO going out the door, and 4 times as likely to be getting a truly electronic invoice coming back from the suppliers. The critical enabler here is supplier onboarding and enablement. So getting electronic transactions is not something that any organization can do unilaterally. It's only accomplished when the suppliers are enabled to conduct business electronically with you. So really being able to focus here on applying the Pareto principle, the 20% of suppliers that generate 80% of the transactions are the ones that really are most critical to enable for electronic PO delivery and receipt and electronic invoice submission. So let's talk a little bit about suppliers. We sort of started to segue towards the suppliers, and they're customers too. And what does it take to establish customer centricity with the suppliers? So one of the most popular steps is first to deploy a supplier portal that not only enables those suppliers to confirm and acknowledge your PO, do a PO flip to create an electronic invoice, but gives them full visibility to their invoice approval and payment status, and can actually drive much greater productivity on behalf of your team in AP, because they no longer have to field those inquiry calls coming in from suppliers saying, did you get my invoice? When am I going to be paid? And of course, some of the other strategies being taken here to improve customer centricity with suppliers, and hopefully in the process become customer of choice to those suppliers, is making it clear to those suppliers who their single point of contact is, so that their questions or inquiries can be addressed in a timely manner. Establishing goals and metrics for the supplier relationship so that they know there's a clear rubric or that they're going to be graded by so that they can improve their performance and track their progress. And of course, not everything's done online. A lot of this can be automated, including, electronic forums with suppliers to have those more, sort of unstructured communications. But I think one of the best practice recommendations here is, even with all the technology, there's no substitute for still having those face-to-face meetings and business reviews with suppliers from time to time, because it is a supplier relationship that you're looking to nurture on a go-forward basis. So some of the keys to inquiry management, it's both about the quality of the process and the quality of those communications. So in terms of the process with suppliers, again, we're talking about from an internal procurement and AP standpoint, issuing POs, hopefully electronic, no-touch POs, electronic online receiving and approval, updating the supplier master data, and so on. And with the external element, it's being able to manage those POs and manage the entire workflow around the procure-to-pay process. And as much as possible, enabling self-service access both to internal stakeholders as well as the suppliers themselves. So a little bit of quantification about what is this worth. If you take this step of deploying a supplier portal, extend your customer-centric focus to the external suppliers as well, and really digitize this process, some of the most significant benefits that have been identified in this area start with a dramatic reduction in the volume of paper invoices, so 42% on average, accompanied by reducing the cost to process an invoice on the order of about a third, significantly spending almost 1/4 less time in the AP function on responding to supplier inquiries because they now have self-service access, improving the on-time payment rate. After all, we're accelerating the whole invoice receipt and approval process by automating the AP function by about a third, and also improving by nearly 40% the first pass match rate. So if you have a three-way match process and you've got an electronic PO, invoice, and goods receipt, and you did a flip of the PO to the invoice at a line item level, it increases the likelihood significantly that you can do an automated three-way match, that at a line level everything's going to add up because you've transferred the data directly from the PO to the invoice. So that means spending much less time from a back-end AP standpoint on managing exceptions by increasing the first pass match rate. So just another example of governance practices here. This one is cited from Mondelez, and really, in addition to creating this kind of visibility through an online portal, also conducting those business reviews, those face-to-face meetings with suppliers, so not losing sight of the relationship aspect as well. So one quick case study for you here around supplier enablement. This is in the banking and financial services industry, and it really speaks to the fact that the Pareto principle really does apply in nearly every case. So the 80-20 rule applying here that said 20% of suppliers account for 80% of the volume. Let's focus the initial onboarding efforts on those top 500 suppliers and really make sure that within those suppliers, given the fact that they're at different levels of technical capability, that there's a means for all of those suppliers to interact online with the buying organization. In this case, again, the 80-20 rule applied. So 20% of those suppliers were the larger suppliers that are already e-commerce capable, so they could, implement PO and invoice transactions through a standard protocol such as CXML or EDI. But 80% were at more mid-tier or smaller suppliers, all they needed was browser access to the portal to be able to essentially conduct business on a level playing field with those larger tier 1 suppliers and being able to drive the kind of benefits that you see here, 30% reduction in order cycle time, fully 87% labor efficiency reduction in FTE costs around vendor management, because you've now enabled the suppliers to do more of this for themselves, and 40% overall reduction in invoice process cycle time. And the last point I want to cover today is, again, this notion that adopting customer centricity drives world-class performance. There's clearly a correlation to better results. It's going to drive higher user satisfaction, but that doesn't mean that all customers are necessarily created equal. So the best practice that a lot of organizations are adopting, as shown by this Hackett diagram here, is really segmenting or stratifying their different categories of spend and making sure that they focus more of their efforts on the ones that are worthy of their attention. So 40% influenced by strategic sourcing, 10% by a buying desk, et cetera. And as you get more towards the tail spend categories, those are areas where they don't necessarily warrant that kind of high-touch concierge level of support. And many organizations are seeking to enable end users, especially where there are business rules, for example. So you may have spend categories that the delegation of authority says if it's less than $25,000 in spend, let's say, for example, procurement really doesn't have to get involved, but the end user is still required to get 3 competitive quotes. Well, here there's a new class of tool in the Zycus world. This is known as Quick Source, that enables self-service sourcing on behalf of end users. So a tactical or spot buy, 3 bids and a buy, can be done with a simple 1-page RFQ on a single screen that any end user, non-procurement user, can do on their own. And importantly, this gives them the ability to create and invite new suppliers on the fly. So all they need is an email address for that supplier that can create a 1-page simple RFX to capture that 3 bids and a buy type of project. It can include any attachments. They get a side-by-side comparison of the bid responses and can easily select and award the business on those lower dollar value transactions that could consume an inordinate amount of time for the procurement function. So all different strategies and techniques for driving customer centricity, and really how world-class leading procurement organizations are correlating these capabilities to new levels of performance for those best-in-class organizations. So really appreciate your joining today's webinar. I know covered a lot of ground in a short period of time, but any additional questions that you may have, and I've consumed all the time, please feel to reach out to us to get more information. And thanks so much for your time and attention today.